Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Tim Palmer, and if you're not familiar with Tim, Tim is a producer and mixer based out of Texas who has worked with a large range of artists, everyone from Ozzy Osbourne, David Bowie, Tears for Fears, Pearl Jam, Goo Goo Dolls, U2, and a whole bunch more. And in today's episode, we get into some really cool stuff, mainly around the topic of the little details that go a long way in separating a pro mix from an amateur mix. And it's often the very minute details that a professional engineer will focus on and put care and attention to that so many amateur engineers just kind of gloss over and think, I shouldn't touch that. I'm just a mixing engineer, or I don't need to worry about that. But they really do matter, especially when you add up all these little details. And as you'll hear in this episode, Tim talks a lot about things that might actually end up being bigger changes, but often the artists don't know about it. Maybe it's re-recording a part. Maybe it's editing details that they don't know about. But either way, it's stuff that matters when you as the mixer are trying to get the sound that you hear in your head to come out of the speakers. You need to be thinking about what you're working with and how to make the most out of those tracks. And ultimately, when you pay attention to these little details and when you give them the time of day and you focus on fixing things up or cleaning things up or adding things or whatever it is that is necessary, once you have that foundation there, it allows you to make better mixes as a result of it. And whether the artist has to know about what went into the project or not, they don't really need to. As long as at the end of the day, you're giving the artist something that sounds incredible. That's what really matters. So I think this is a really helpful episode for people to hear because it's going to give you a new appreciation for the things that you should be listening for. And it's going to give you an appreciation for what makes something sound professional. If you're struggling to make your tracks have a professional sound, maybe some of these details that Tim talks about here are things that you need to start implementing into your own mixes as well. So with that said, I think this is a really good one. Let's just jump right into it. Tim Palmer, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Nice to meet you, and I'm happy to be on.
Thanks for being on. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, what kind of projects you've worked on, can you give us that background on all that stuff and ultimately how you got into music production?
Well, I've been doing this quite a long time. I started in about 1980, and I started in the very traditional way of being a runner, or as we call it in my country, a T-boy. So I basically had an incredible love of music, and I was in bands at school, and I wanted to have a job in music, but I didn't actually know what kind of jobs existed until we did some demos with our band. And then I saw the recording engineer and I saw what a studio looked like. So, of course, that was it. I was bitten. I wanted to do that. And the only way that you could get into a studio was to obviously write to them all and hopefully end up at the very bottom, just literally tidying up cables, making tea, that sort of stuff. I managed to succeed in doing that. And I started at a studio in London in the early 80s. As I said, I think it was about 80 or 81. It was called Utopia Studios. Yeah, I mean, some people would say they don't enjoy running around after people and clearing up, but as long as I was involved in the creation of a record, whatever form that was in, it made me very happy, and I wanted to stay late and be there, and I just loved the whole process. So it was an easy one for me. And they always say that you don't really work a day of your life if you do something you love, and I sort of feel like that. I feel very lucky that I've been able to do it.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I think that even when you're getting started, those early days, like, yeah, sure, you may have that vision of like, I want to be the person behind the board and, setting up the mics and stuff like that. But there is something really cool to just like observing the process and seeing how it goes down and how different engineers do things. And I think there's a lot that you can learn from that. And it's not just about jumping in and, it's like actually see how the process goes and learn people's workflows. I think that that's a really important step that a lot of people are just impatient to learn.
It really is. And it's something that I think is lost with the way that we educate people about recording music now, because I was fortunate enough to sit and watch professionals and famous producers and not so famous producers, and just watch and learn and see which things I thought they did well that would apply to me, and see which things I thought they did badly. Oftentimes you'll watch the way a producer deals with a problem on a song and think to yourself, wow, okay, well, the band are all really pissed off and don't want to carry on anymore, so that wasn't very clever. But being able to sit back and watch the whole thing happen in real time is valuable. And as I said, I was able to assist for people like Rod Temperton, Rod wrote most of the Off the Wall album for Michael Jackson, and he was a member of Heatwave, and he wrote State of Independence for Donna Summer, and he was just this legendary producer in the 80s. And I was able to watch the way he worked and the way that he constructed a session and things like that are totally invaluable.
Yeah, and I like what you said there too about just like observing some of like the bad ways that people handle things too. I think that is a really important thing. You'll learn very quickly once you start running your own sessions that like you have to be that psychologist in the room sometimes, and you have to be the one that's thinking ahead, and there's a lot that you can learn just from watching how someone else makes mistakes. And you quickly, if you're astute to it, you'll learn very quickly like, okay, not to do those things in the future, and how to handle it in your own sessions, and be that much better when it comes to your turn to take charge of everything. When you were getting started, like what ultimately made you want to get into music production? Like were you kind of just starting off as a musician trying to record yourself, or like what made you think that the studio life was for you?
Well, as I said, I wasn't really aware. I was a massive music fan. Originally in the 70s, I was into the whole glam rock thing like everybody was as a young boy. And then when punk rock came along, I was about 16, 17. So it was almost like it was made for me. And myself and my mates, we would go and see the Clash and the Ramones and the Jam and stuff like that. And it was just incredible. I mean, it was a wonderful time to be in love with music and go out and buy your singles in the pick sleeve and collect it was just great. Anyway, we formed a band as you're supposed to when you love punk music. The famous T-shirt says, "Here's a chord, here's another chord, now go and form a band." Well, we sort of did that. We didn't really know what we were doing, but we had a bloody good time doing it. And, we started to get better. But I think I realized pretty soon that I wasn't going to cut it as a studio vocalist. Maybe okay on the guitar, but I certainly wasn't going to make it. But I did love the process when we record our demos. Walking into a studio and watching the engineer with all the tracks and seeing how he set the microphones up and watching his process made me think, oh, I'd love to be involved in the creation of music. So that was what sparked the original thing. Yeah, and from there, when I got my first job, it was just an exciting adventure all the way.
Nice, I love that. It's interesting because you talked about like being into a lot of punk rock, and I can relate to that as well. That's what I grew up listening to, and I think there's a lot of people that get into this industry thinking that they're gonna just work on like one genre of music, like the thing that excites them, and that's what they get into. That's all that they really want to work on. But when I look at your career, you've gone through a lot of different genres. You've worked on a lot of different things with different artists of different levels of success and all that. How important is that diversity to you these days? Like, do you still did you go into it thinking like, oh, I want to be the punk rock guy, or were you very open-minded to that idea of like, I'll take whatever comes my way?
No, I didn't. I can't. I think when you're young and you're trying to be successful and just move forward, you basically do what you can. I didn't actually make a conscious effort to be genreless, but saying that, I think it was the best thing that happened to me. Being able to work with Sepultura, say, and then work with Tears for Fears, is wonderful because it keeps the job exciting and you're constantly learning something new. And strangely enough, you can bring something from a genre that seems like it would have nothing to do with the record you're doing at that moment, but you've learned something, a technique or an idea, and you can bring that, because let's face it, a lot of the genres is basically, it's just another word for presentation. Genre is just presentation. We can play the same set of notes, but we present them in different ways with different sensibilities. So learning from each of those has brought something new to the table for me. And yeah, I feel very fortunate actually, that I've been able to work with jazz artists and heavy metal guys and stuff like that, because it's just made it so much more fun for me as well. It keeps you excited in what you're doing. And as I said, you can bring something new, I think, too.
Of course. Yeah, I definitely think that once you get into the world of production, you start to just love production. You don't really care about what the genre is necessarily. It's just like you find new things to be excited about in the process. And, I love when people go through like my I'm going to date myself here, my CD collection or my cassette collection, it's like they'll find things that are just like, what, you listen to that? And it's like, yeah, because there's some really cool productions in there. And like, I don't care if it's like Christina Aguilera or if it's like whatever, Guar or some other like, heavy metal band, whatever. It's just like, you find little elements of it that make it exciting and that you feel attracted to. So I think that's one of the cool things about music production is just like, yeah, it doesn't matter once you get into it. You can find something.
It doesn't. I think also that when we do this as our career path, the concept of repeated listening to a piece of work is just a given. I mean, we have to be able to listen to it hundreds of times. But my wife will say, how can you listen to that over and over again? But when you're crafting something, you're so lost in what you're trying to achieve that it sort of doesn't really bother you at all. And the other thing that I find is that you find the beauty of what somebody's trying to do when you get repeated listenings. Sometimes, or at least now with the world of Spotify, people are judging something and a piece of work on about a 30-second clip. And they're basing whether they'll listen to it again on that. In the old days, and I'm not going to be one of these people that just hark back to everything being better back then, because some things weren't and some things were. But it is true that when we would drive to work in the car, if a song made a playlist on a radio station that you constantly listened to as you drove around, you would hear it the first time and think, okay, not bad. Second time, sort of something in that for me. Third time, oh, actually, I like that. And by the weekend, you actually might go out and buy the single or the album. And the only reason is because you've had the opportunity to learn it and experience it and find the beauty in it. And on first listen, often that doesn't happen. And I feel that, that's something that we've lost, is that concept of trying to like something and getting into something, listening to a body of work like an album. People don't do that anymore. And it's like anything else in this world. They say that to like a new taste in food, you have to have it 15, 20 times or whatever. I don't know what the actual number is, but it's completely the same concept. You need to hear it more than once to appreciate it or taste it more than once. I really enjoy the whole process. I really do.
For sure. I think you bring up a great point there about just that repeated listen thing. To me, it's like, there's so many songs that I hear on the radio the first time and I'm like, this is on the radio? Like, why? And then, I'll hear it 15, 30 times and I'm like, this is a banger. Like it kind of it catches up to you and you start to really appreciate the magic of it. And, sometimes it's always great when it catches you on the first listen, but sometimes things have to grow and you can still learn to appreciate those details that maybe you missed the first couple of times. So,
yeah. And let's face it, with an album, I mean, how many times do we hear that, you get it by an album and you've heard the single, and when you first put the album on, you love the single, that's your favorite. And then there's a couple of strange tracks near the end of the album that you're not so sure about. Give it 6 months, you're tired of the single because there's something about its creation that is about instant appeal that has to try and grab you quickly. So therefore, as a result of that, as a consequence of that, you tire of it a little quicker. Whereas the sort of strange tracks further into the album that took a while to grow into become your favorites. And I mean, how many times have we heard that? Well, it doesn't matter whether it's Pink Floyd or whatever. I mean, it's just true, right?
Yeah, of course. This is maybe getting super nerdy, but I even really get super granular with it, where like even the transitions between songs, like make that song that wasn't that great, like it makes it better because it's just the way it hits you. Like you feel something the way it comes in. And again, those are just little production details that a lot of people don't pay attention to. But I think the more you're in this, the more you learn to appreciate what people are going for with something as small as like a transition between songs,
Speaking of transitions, I mean, that whole system to creating the flow of an album, you had to, we would sit around with the artists and you play the album, the beginning of the side, right through to the end of side one. And you had to get those transitions right. It wasn't, just one song, next song. Sometimes there might be a crossfade. Some songs need to butt up really fast. Some songs you need to okay, take a breather, now the next song begins. Things like that. It's an art in that, of putting a body of work together that's probably being lost, because let's face it, if somebody accidentally leaves their iPod on shuffle, then that whole thought process and planning is completely gone out the window, because they'll be hearing track 4 straight after the first track instead of track 2, etc., etc. So that doesn't matter. But I can even remember in the 80s when I was doing Robert Plant's Now and Zen album. When we came to put the album together, we were putting all the mixes and putting the reels together, and there was one particular song, and we kept thinking, I don't know whether I've got it on that mix. It doesn't seem right. It doesn't feel good. There must be, it's lacking power. There was something wrong with it. And then Robert said, no, well, let's just change that, because if we put that song over here, then before it, you'll feel differently. And then when it comes in, it'll probably, you'll be able to realize its power because of what's come before it. And we just changed the running order around. Fine. It was perfect. But just literally by changing that running order made you feel differently about what was to come. So yeah, it's a whole different world now.
I love that. Yeah. Well, speaking of the whole new world, obviously things have changed, and your career has spanned decades, and you're still very successful at what you do. So what is it that what steps do you take personally to keep up to date with music trends or production trends, so that the work that you do still remains modern sounding and, continues to follow what people are listening for these days?
Well, I think the main thing is to obviously continue to listen to music. I mean, if you love music and you're listening to new albums, then subconsciously you're aware of some of the changes and the zeitgeist of that particular time. Obviously, during certain periods of music, it's okay to have a lot of reverb, and then other times reverb seemed to have vanished from production value, especially in rock music. And then slowly it started to creep back in, and now we're in a sort of place where anything goes. By listening to music and enjoying music and hearing people's work, that's your way of staying up to date. And the same thing within your DAW. If you're working and you're constantly, you hear about a plugin that does something, and you give it a trial period and see whether it works for you. I think it's very important to do that. But as far as being able to do this for a long time, the truth is that as a mixing engineer, we're only really as good as the music that we're presented with to mix. So if you start working on music that doesn't inspire you or you don't feel good about, that's a slippery slope, I think. The main thing is to get yourself connected to stuff that has values, if you can, stuff that you believe in, stuff that you feel is saying something. And then half of your job is done, because as a mixer, the greatest cure for a bad mix is a great song. And I've always said that, and I stand by it. If you're mixing an incredible performance, something that is special, something with a great lyric, something with just a great song structure, then you have the opportunity at the mix stage to hopefully take that up to the next level. But the fact is that if your drums are a little loud or your drums are a little quiet, it's still a bloody great song, and people will actually may even love your mix for that mistake. You might find you mix a song and make the drums a bit loud, and because they fall in love with the song so much, they wouldn't change that fact that the drums were too loud. That becomes part of the song as well. And you fall in love with the song the way it's presented to you, which is another conversation about something that we used to have called demoitis, where you can't leave the fact that you fell in love with it the way it was on a demo, which was imperfect. But now with the way that we record, we don't have to deal with demos anymore. But sometimes keeping that imperfection or that mistake or whatever it is, it becomes part of the whole song, and it's very forgiving. So getting yourself connected to great music and great artists is the most important thing that I think you can do.
For sure. Well, it's funny because you mentioned the idea of how trends will come and go, and you specifically mentioned reverb. And that was something that I wanted to ask you about, especially as it relates to Pearl Jam's 10 record, which you mixed. At the time, they're like, grunge was something that was trying to distance itself from a lot of the hair metal bands of that day. And, the hair metal bands were known for that, like really big reverbed out sound and, moving away from like that 80s kind of thing. Like, and so with that record there in particular, with Pearl Jam being a grunge band, like, did you ever feel, what was the philosophy going into that record? Because that record is pretty reverberant. Like, you got a lot of verb on the snares, everything sounds big. And I guess you can't have a song like Alive without it sounding live, I guess. But what was your philosophy going into that record and maybe going against the grain of the trends at the time of, grunge drying up?
Well, if you think of it historically, when I mixed that record, the grunge sound hadn't really been created. We were still, at the time that I was mixing it, I remember I used to have a TV on in the control room of the studio, and the Scorpions song, I forget what it's called now, the one about Gorky Park, the ballad with the whistling and all that, that was on the TV all the time. And metal music and rock music was still in full force. In the underground, the grunge scene was starting to pick up. And when we did the 10 record, the band all flew over to England, and there was never a conversation about, hey, look, this is the new sound. We're stripping it back. We're not using studio reverbs. We just want to have a dry performance. If there had been that, I would have been happy to listen and talk about that and work within that framework. But we weren't thinking like that. All I was thinking of was, wow, this is a great record with a great bunch of songs. They've essentially recorded it basically very live. There wasn't many overdubs on there, so there was a lot of space for me to enhance what I believed was enhancing the songs with a bit of delay on Eddie, and then drying up the middle sections, making them really in your face, and then making them big again. And I was basically using all the textures that were available to me as a mixing engineer at the time, and just enjoying it. I wasn't thinking, oh, I better not do that because grunge is going to be dry in 5 years or whatever. So I was not feeling restricted whatsoever. And each morning the band would come in, and obviously they were in the same headspace, because there was never once a conversation of, do you think we're using too much studio reverb? It wasn't even thought of. It was just, do the songs sound good? Is the performance working well? Do we like it? We'd make a few changes on levels. Maybe we would add some more guitars, things like that. But never was the conversation about whether the record was sounding a bit too big or too reverby. What's funny about it is, I think that, when they expressed disappointment later about how their record sounded a bit too reverbed out, they finally remixed it with Brendan O'Brien. But by the time they did that, music had already started to go back towards reverb anyway. So the record I made is more contemporary sounding than the dry one. The dry one doesn't really work for me. And in fact, most of the reviews I've read from the fans, they miss it because it brought something else. It gave it a certain largeness, and I don't know. As I said, it wasn't overly thought. The 10 record was mixed in about 14 days, something like that. It was very instinctive. I just responded to what was there, and having the guys all at the studio with me was wonderful because we got to hang out and talk about what we were trying to achieve. Yeah, it's a special record for me, that really was.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the idea of remixing, because it's such a delicate subject, especially for a record like that was so big, because that record had already existed. People were so used to hearing it. It was like a soundtrack to their lives. And so those little details, like what we were talking about earlier, like those things stick in people's minds. So then to start stripping away at some of those details can drastically change things. So the whole remix or remaster stage, it's such a delicate line, I think, between preserving what's great about a record and, enhancing it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Right? The idea, I don't know if this was in something you wanted to talk about, but what's interesting as well, as we progressed from the 80s through, well, it started pretty much in the 80s, was before that, the 60s and the 70s, a record producer would make a record with an artist. They would be chosen because they fit together well. The artist wanted to work with the producer liked the artist. So let's make a record. You go through all the different stages, the pre-production, which is so important, the recording of the music. And then it was a natural thing that you continued on as the producer and you finished the record so that you got it to be the way that you had decided it should be with the group. I mean, this was a concept that you were working on all the way through the recording. And the person who would mix it would be the engineer of the record, who'd probably recorded the album as well. So that team would stay together from the conception right through to the end. It was only in the 80s that record companies started to sometimes maybe think, oh, I think they've lost it a little bit at the mix stage. So let's bring in someone who's had nothing to do with the whole process, who can maybe weed through and say, okay, they've gone too much here, too much there, a bit more here, and give you a fresh perspective on the recordings. That drove producers crazy at the time. I understand why it was a necessity, because we don't get it right all the time. There's no doubt about it. And sometimes someone at the label might realize that and think we need somebody fresh in. So it's not a bad thing. But before that, it really didn't exist. And I think the first person I was aware of that would be brought in to do that was Tom Lord Alge. Tom started to mix records that he hadn't been involved in. From that point onwards, there was a separate job title. You have the mixing engineer and the producer, and they could be completely separate and don't even speak to each other. I mean, I can't tell you how many records I've mixed without having to deal with the producer, which I know for a fact it drove them crazy, because they might not have wanted it to be presented the way that I wanted to mix it, but I was given the job to mix it, so I just had to do what I thought was right. Oftentimes now, as you can imagine, I don't even get to meet the artist. Many times I meet the artist way later. I was in LA last year. I was going to the Lifetime Achievement Awards at the Grammys. And I was coming downstairs to have breakfast in a diner that was underneath a hotel I was staying in. And my wife said, oh, look, there's Jeff Goldblum. And he was sitting in a booth right by the front door. And I said, oh, my God, I love Jeff Goldblum. I've never met him. I mixed an album for him. So she said, you should go and say hi. So I went, hey, Jeff. And he was super nice. And he's like, hey, who I said, I'm Tim. I mixed your last album. And he's like, oh, great. It sounded great. But that's so bizarre to me, that whole idea of meeting the artist and having a chat after the album's already been released about 6 months later, right? Strange.
That's amazing. So then, like, going into a new project, then what's your typical approach to a new project? Like, how do you start, or what do you start? What are you listening for? And how are you coming up with your roadmap for what you want to do with a new mix?
Well, as you know, I don't really produce records very often these days. But saying that, I think the way that the industry has gone and the way that people work with budgets and time and money, I think being a producer is sort of part of being a mixer now, in a way. And the reason I say that is in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even the early parts of the 2000s, I mean, if you made a record, you were usually signed to a label, which meant that you had a decent amount of money to make a record. So that gave you the opportunity to work with hopefully a producer that sort of knows what they're doing, be in a studio that sounds pretty good, using microphones that are good quality, and working with engineers who know what they're doing. So consequently, when it came to the mix, hopefully a lot of the great stuff was already in there, and it was about balancing. Mixing was about balancing and getting a vibe. Nowadays, because there's a lot of people making music, a lot of people aren't making a lot of money from music, and therefore they're trying to achieve it on very little. So oftentimes now I'll get a project and I'll think, okay, this is good. I like this. I sort of need to finish it. And I'll explain that to them and I'll say, look, I'm going to do some stuff, but please understand that if I add a part to a chorus and you don't like it, it's very easy for me to mute it. So give me free range to do what I think's right, and I'll show you how I think your song should be. So as a mixer now, I find that I'm sort of have a producer's hat on at the same time, and a musician's hat, because if you can play an instrument to be a mixing engineer, it makes a big difference. Because whether it's thinking, okay, well, this particular vocalist sort of has an interesting voice, but he struggles to get the tune across in the chorus, I'll double that with a keyboard, or I'll double that with a guitar. If you can play an instrument, that happens very quickly, and you can put that into the music. So that's important too. But yes, I found that as a producer now, I'll often listen to a piece of recorded music that I'm asked to mix and say to the artist, look, I'm going to do a couple of edits to the arrangement, maybe shorten a re-intro or shorten a solo section, whatever it may be. And if they have a guitar, say, in a verse, I might think I'd like to double that with a tremolo guitar, or I feel that the chorus should be more rhythmical, so I might put a shaker or a tambourine on. Or a band I just finished working recently, they didn't really have harmonies, and I felt that the chorus would just nail it if it had a very simple, strong harmony. So I would sing on it even and tune things and play around. And that's sort of become part of the mixing process to me now. I know a lot of other people don't do that, but that's what I do, because I feel that, I just want to show them how their piece of music that they're trying to be as successful as it can be, and show them how I feel that it could be. So things have changed a lot the first thing I would do when I hear a song that I'm about to mix is obviously to listen to the rough mix and listen to the song and try and figure out at that point, what is it about this piece of recorded music that I feel is special? What is the defining quality of this music? It may be, okay, well, this is a groove song. This is very important that this groove's right, because the drum rhythm with the bass, it drives it along and it's so exciting. So don't fuck that up. You've got to get that right. Another song you might be listening to and you think, wow, it's all about that guy, the singer, and his lyric. So your approach to the mixing is obviously going to be, how can I carve out this mix so that this story is told clearly? And you can approach the songs in many different ways. As you know, sometimes you start with the drums. That's the most traditional way. Other times you might not do that. You might start with the vocal and build things around it. So listening to and deciding what you think are the strengths of the recorded material is key to how you're going to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like how you put that too. I think it's important that, that early first listen, you are thinking about it from the producer's perspective of, how can I make this start with the best foundation? How can I have all the tracks that I need there to make this song sound big and to get all the elements that you ultimately hear that should be in the mix? So I think that that's like a cool way of just getting started to make sure that you've got that foundation set. And then I definitely agree with you as far as like finding the cool elements that you need to preserve and the interactions between instruments. I think that's really important as well there.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about a piece of, a mix is that you're basically, it's a story that's being told to your ears, and it has to be introduced in a certain way so that you have the dynamics. And does the first verse want to stay here and then the chorus lift and then back down to the second, or is there something in a re-intro that needs to build? So it's like a structure, and you have to make sure that it unfolds in the right way. Be constantly thinking about dynamics and how things work. I mean, there's so many things you can play around with and learn, whether it's bringing in guitars closer to the vocal in the verse to keep it in this place, and then at the chorus whacking them out full wide, whether it's something like that, which is sort of subliminal, but it just gives you the feeling of space and a different dimension, or whether it's things like playing around with how things sit as far as loops. Sometimes there's a part in a song that's like playing a long time alongside a vocal. It might be a guitar arpeggio, let's say. Let's just use that as an example. So the guy's picking a guitar arpeggio, and as the vocal is singing, sometimes you realize that the playing, because it's so human, you sort of get distracted a little bit. Your ear is being pulled to the guitar arpeggio because of the playing. So in that particular case, you could try looping the best version of that arpeggio so that it's perfect and it just ticks away and it tips over round and round and it sits subliminally, and then your ear goes directly to the lead vocal. You're concentrating on the lead vocal. You want to hear the lead vocal. So once you go to the next section where the vocal is stopped, you allow the performance of the arpeggio to become human again, so that your ear goes to the arpeggio, which is what you want to hear at that point. And then when it returns to the vocal and you want to hear the vocal, then it can go back to being the loop. And the listener, hopefully, won't even be aware what you've done. They'll just be thinking, wow, I'm really enjoying the vocal here. And then they'll also be enjoying the performance of that guitar in the right spots. So all those silly little games that you can learn and play with a mix are very important and very easy to achieve in this world of Pro Tools and digital editing. And I mean, the world is your oyster. If you can think it, you can do it.
Yeah, I love that. It's really taken this like no compromise approach to your mixing, where it's like you're just focusing on doing whatever it takes to make it sound the tightest and the least distracting possible, and really just focusing on getting the elements that need to be in the front of the mix featured, and anything else is just kind of sitting where it needs to be in the background. And I think that's a really cool approach, because I do think that a lot of people play it too safe when it comes to their mixes. They're afraid to touch the tracks that are there because maybe they're afraid that like, oh, I'm messing up the natural performance of an artist. But it's like, if what they did is distracting, why wouldn't you fix it? In the end, like we're all musicians. We're all trying to be tight at our instrument. We're all trying to play like to the click or whatever, So why not make it better and make it perfect so that it's not distracting?
Yeah, the thing about people get frightened and they say, oh, the machines are taking over, but you're the boss. You decide whether you want to do it, right? If you don't like it, switch it off, right? And also, things like, even with pitching, sometimes you can be distracted by a part because it's a bit out of tune. So maybe in that verse, you don't want to be distracted, so you can tune it, but it doesn't mean you have to tune everything. But, sometimes you can think of tuning as like, it's part of the character almost of the sound. So if you have a vocalist and he sings a little flat or sharp, that's not a bad thing because it's drawing you into something emotionally. It's an emotive thing. But another part in the song, it may be exactly what you don't want. You need it all to sit together tight. And being in tune will make it sit in a little more because it's blended with all the right parts of the note. So you can use tuning as well, leaving things and fixing things according to what the song needs at that particular moment. It's a wonderful thing to be in control of the technology. People would say, oh, you're going to fix all the drums, you're going to take that and you're going to make it all perfect. Well, if you hear a drum performance and you're trying to edit it and you hear the first verse and the guy's killing it, it slams in the first verse. But in the second verse, it's just got a bit human and it's a bit funky. Then what do you want to choose? Maybe you want to choose the funky, weird one and have that twice, right? Which is actually using the computer to make it sound more human because you've taken the verse that wasn't as tight. You don't have to pick the tight verse and have it twice. That's your call. You're the boss. Maybe if you don't want it to be slick, then choose that verse that's a bit just on the edge and just feels a little uncomfortable and use that again. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to accept responsibility for being the boss of the technology.
I love that. I think that's important. And that's why people are coming to you. They want your expert opinion. So, why not give it to them, and make it the best version you can do. And then they can decide whether they like that or not,
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that happens now, especially where I am in my career, because I've been doing it so long. If somebody isn't going to let me try to show them and they start doing that, I say, look, why don't you just do it yourself? If you know how you want it and you don't need my opinion, then don't pay me this money. You go ahead, go and do it. I'm not saying that my mix will be better than yours. Far from it. All I can give you is my perspective and my opinion. By no means is my opinion the right one. It's just my one, and that's what you're paying me for. So if you're going to not allow me to do it, then I feel like I'm wasting your time.
Well, going back to that idea of like creating your vision for your mix and what you want to do with it, like you've worked with a lot of artists that have had success in the past, and like when I think of like U2 or Ozzy, working with those kind of artists. So when you start a mix for an artist like that, how concerned are you with the sound of their previous records, and are you at all referencing any of those previous recordings to guide your decisions in your mix, or are you just sticking to the fact that it's like, hey, it's my mix, I'm starting it the way I would want to hear it?
Well, I think, subconsciously you're aware of a band's history. I think it would be foolish to, if you took, say, try and give you an obvious example, like somebody like Ozzy, who has a certain voice that everybody loves and is known for a long time, that is essentially created by 2 or 3 tracks that are all a little bit out of tune. And together he manages to make this thing, which is Ozzy, right? So if I was going to try and pretend that had never happened before I worked with Ozzy and just have one lead vocal, I think you would be on a loser already. I don't think people would want to hear Ozzy like that. So I think you are, even if it's subliminally, you are aware of what people have done before. But saying that, you're trying to make this piece of music they've recorded at that moment work the best way that it possibly can. That doesn't mean to say that you have to start using the same tricks that they did on the last record. You really have to play to the strengths of the recorded material, as I said before. It's very interesting when you're working with artists, like sometimes they surprise you. Like when I was working with U2, I can remember distinctly making the drums on a couple of songs sound, what they said was, it sounds too big. We don't want our drums sounding big and masculine. We like our drums to sound a little smaller. And I took a step back and thought, okay, yeah, I can see that. I can see that because you want the emphasis to be more on the other things, and the drums are playing more of a supporting role than maybe I was thinking that they should. So it is interesting, and working as a team is very important, especially when you're working with some of these successful artists that have very strong opinions. What is scary about working with some of the more successful artists that have a track record is if you want to try and change what they've recorded, you feel slightly, it's a bit scary to actually replay somebody's guitar who's very successful, but you have to sort of keep it to yourself. Do it. Do what you think is right, and then hope that they come back and go, wow, that sounds so much better. You don't have to say, hey, I'm going to re-record your guitars that you played. That would be a foolish mistake, right? But if you can get in there and do it, and the song works better, if they're any decent sort of listener, they'll say, wow, I don't know what it is, but it sounds so much better. And it might be because you played a guitar or you fixed a percussion part, whatever it is. I mean, you know, I know that I've played on a lot of records that I shouldn't have done. I've said nothing about it and the artist has been happy. And if it made the record better, I don't care.
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things where like the artist doesn't need to know the black magic that went into it. And they shouldn't. Like, if you were like, hey, Edge, I decided to play your guitar, you know, they'd be like, what? Like, you know, or, you know, going back to what you were talking about earlier, just like how you'd be a fool not to listen to the previous recordings. If you told the Edge that you were going to turn off his delay because it didn't sound cool, he'd be like, well, you lost the gig, you know? So
exactly. Well, you know, luckily I wasn't having to play any of Edge's part. I don't think I could play it that well, but you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, exactly. That's the point, is that if you took Edge's guitar delay off, he records it with the delay anyway, so you actually couldn't. But yeah, you'd be surprised. People are more open-minded than they think they are. As I said, if you get them involved in the black magic and said, look, I'm going to do this now, they would be, oh, no, don't do that. But if you actually do it, and then present it when it's the finished idea. This is one of the things that have been nicer about working on your own, because I know for a fact if I sat around with a guitar and various things, fiddling around with ideas with an artist in the room, they'd be like, what the fuck is this guy doing to our song? But it takes me a while to try and find it. And then you find something, then you put it in the right place, then you put it in their song and play it to them. They respond in the right way, but you don't want them to get involved in the nuts and bolts. Not all the time, anyway.
Totally. And I think too that like sometimes taking that shot to the ego, to the artist, like that could cost you the next project, you know? So why not just like do it right and make it so they don't even know about it, but it just sounds great and they're happy with it. And then they'll want to come back to you next time, right? Well, one element that I wanted to ask you about as it relates to your mixes that I think you do a really great job with is the sound of your snares. And I'm a drummer, so I tend to focus on drums a lot. You know, when I listen to songs like Break It Down Again by Tears for Fears, or, you know, Even Flow by Pearl Jam, like to me, like those snares have like a signature sound to them and they poke out in the mix. They've got lots of crack and they're just like really iconic sounding snares. And so I'm curious to know, like when it comes to mixing snare in a mix, what's your secret for getting snares to cut through in a track?
Well, nowadays it's often a combination of samples and using the real snare. Obviously, if somebody has recorded a snare incredibly well and they're a great drummer, then with the right EQ and compression, that's all you need. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, there are times still where I'm like, wow, this is great. But as a mixer, you know, if they're presenting you something that just isn't very good, then you've got to make a way to make it great. Break It Down Again is programming. And it's a mixture of programming and a loop. So it's a combination. Often I find nowadays I'm using a combination. I might, if I've got a certain snare that's been recorded well, I'll just use something just underneath. I'm really painfully boring about putting snare samples in. I don't use I very rarely use anything like the Stephen Slate or the Trigger plugins. I'll literally go in and I will paste my samples in so that they completely phase accurate to every single hit manually. And I'll ride them up with the levels, and so that if they are sitting behind a snare that you won't be able to be aware of it. That's what I hope anyway. Things like ghost notes, I'm very careful not to lose the ghost notes and things like that, and I'll work on that. Sometimes it can be about keying gates so that your sample comes in, but then the under snare comes up so that you get all the shuffles and things like that. I spend a long time with all that stuff, and it pays dividends to put the time in. Listening to the phase relationships of all the drums and all the mics is so important. You can put an overhead in at the end and not be careful, and when you put that phase button in, you realize, whoa, okay, that's half my sound was disappearing. You have to be really careful with all that stuff. And using samples carefully. I mean, with things like toms, I want to keep just the initial hit of the tom so that I get the stick on the skin. But then I want the decay to carry on without all the cymbals and all that. So I'll find a good sample of the tom and I'll keep the front and I'll crossfade it right after the stickers hit the head so that the sustain of the tom has no bleed, but it carries on over the kit, if you see what I mean. So rather than doing a gate on the tom or fading it out so that they go boop and cut off and then so that they don't get in the way of the cymbals, I'd rather the decay of the tom carried on over the bar or whatever, because the front is natural, but the decay is actually pasted in. Things like that take ages, but it really sounds great when you push it up on the faders and all the tom hits are big and they sustain beautifully. And when the next cymbal kicks in, it doesn't go, because you EQ'd the tom so much, stuff like that. But you can have so much fun with drums nowadays. And now that we can zoom in and, work on under snare mics and do all that stuff, it's amazing what you can do.
Yeah, I think that for that exact reason that you just mentioned there, like that's why I always encourage people when you're recording, like as soon as you got your drum all set up, like take some samples of the kit, because you never know when you need that clean hit to get rid of that bleed and that cymbal decay, all that kind of stuff. So, having some clean hits there of the actual kit, make it super easy to make it sound natural.
Oh, totally. And if you have a good snare and you just want, it's a good sounding snare, it's got a good vibe, but it's just the separation is bad. If you've got that clean snare at the end, you can keep all the snare fills, because it's very hard with samples, even the best triggers, to get it to be natural. If you've got with the under snares and that big thing, it's really hard. So keep the snare fills, don't fuck with those, keep them natural. But then as soon as you've hit the bar and you're going into the verse and you want to concentrate on the singing, your clean snare that you grabbed from the end can be pasted in. So everything is really tight and in its place. So you can go between opening up the original mics to using the samples and stuff like that. It's a combination always.
Yeah, of course. Again, it's like this is all that black magic stuff that goes on that no one needs to know about, but it makes it sound as good as it is. And
I mean, things like room sounds in the old days, before we had all this technology, you work for hours getting a good set of ambience microphones so that you push the drums up and they sound killer and big. But as you know, with cymbal hits into the chorus, or you go into the right cymbal or stuff like that, the room mics may be way too much. But with all this technology we have now, I mean, I have my samples of a great sounding room on the snare and a great sounding room on the kick, and they're separate. So I can just have them coming up and I can create my own rooms, and they're firing perfectly on all the kicks and snares and stuff, but the cymbals aren't going to affect it because they're not part of that ambient. I can use the real room for that. But being able to control everything like that is just, it's a godsend.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I was curious about that, if you were using room samples separately from, just a sample that maybe has it baked in, that kind of thing. But that makes sense. If you have it separate, then you have that independent control and you can make it more rhythmic, I guess, and all that kind of stuff too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what you can do now. I mean, a lot of the time, I'd say 60 to 70% of the time now, I'll put my own cymbals in on top of the overhead. So I'll just paste them in on top of theirs so that I have control, because a lot of the time they've got the ambience of the kit, but funnily enough, the cymbals don't seem to come out the way you want. And you want a nice big smash at the front of the chorus. If you can just put your own in and line them up perfectly, make sure you get the panning right and stuff like that, you can put your cymbals in. I've even been known to kill the hi-hat mic and program a hi-hat if I need to, if I'm trying to get a certain sophisticated feel in a second verse or something like that. You can do that as well. I mean, the world's your oyster as far as what you want to do.
Of course. I love that you even mentioned the cymbal samples too, because again, I think that's another thing that is a small detail that goes a really long way that people don't even think that they can do. But yeah, it when you're trying to just get that initial hit of a chorus, when it comes in, like, it makes so much sense to have a separate cymbal track there, so you're not getting all that snare bleed and everything else that comes along with it. Definitely a cool technique there for sure. Going back to that idea of like getting the crack off of your snares, do you ever use like transient designers or anything like that to help you with that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, sometimes if you're doing a blend of two snares, you might decide that, okay, the original snare just doesn't have that consistent feel that I want. So you put your sample in, but you'll take your original snare and you'll compress it a lot. So you're bringing out all the really great qualities of that snare and that playing, but you don't want the true transients, the transient of the sample and the transient. So some of these transient designer things, there's one called Spiff. And Spiff, you can basically dial back the transient peaks and it's really precise. So you can have your snare drum and it's got all the shuffly stuff and all the vibe and all this sort of crang ringing and all that stuff, but it doesn't, every time the actual hit happens, it dulls it off, and your sample is there, right there, solid and consistent. So you're getting the best of both worlds, and you mix the amount of the real feel and the real vibe, but you have the consistency of the snare hits from the sample. So you can use it both ways. You can be using your transients to take them off like that, or sometimes if you've got a snare drum, you just need a little more, you can use it in that way. I mean, once again, it's every time it's different.
Well, I guess, at the end of the day, when it comes to your mixes, listening back to them, like, what do you think ultimately defines what a great mix sounds like?
Well, there is no definitive answer to that. A great mix, the only thing I can think of as a quality is a mix that brings out the strength of the song, which is what we were talking about earlier. If you listen to a Phil Spector production of, say, You've Lost That Loving Feeling, if you're going to analyze the actual technical aspects of it, you'd immediately say, well, it's got too much reverb on that. It's just a mess. But it isn't. It's great. And it has a vibe. And, somebody could have mixed it in a different way. But is it successful? Yes, it is. And did people like it? Yes, they did. Did the song come through? Yes, it did. So, you have so much leeway when you're mixing. The main thing is you're asking yourself, is this song working? Is it making me feel good right from the beginning to the end? If it's a rock song, does it sound powerful? Do the drums sound big? I mean, each genre has a different set of qualities that you're sort of aware of. If you're making a pop record, you have a very different sensibility to make when you're making a metal record. But essentially, in any of those situations, you're trying to make it as successful as it can, with an ear to the presentation being the genre itself.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, but just how you start a record and, making sure that you've got that foundation and that song is there and it has all the elements. So it makes sense that a good mix needs all of that stuff before you even start doing anything. Without it, you're working against yourself.
When I worked with David Bowie, one of the things that I learned from him was to leave things alone and sometimes to actually look at the mistakes and realize that they might actually be better than you think they are, and they actually could be really important. And the human element, just letting a bit of, the light come through, and the human side of things is very often overlooked because we're very quick to go, oh no, that's a mistake. But sometimes when you make a mistake or there's something recorded badly, it's sort of got a character and it sort of makes it stand out and makes it special. And you've got to be careful not to overlook those things. And sometimes you can create something that is unique to that song by accident. Like a perfect example of that for me, which people often ask me about, is the beginning of the song Black on the Pearl Jam album. When I pushed up the faders on that, I had an idea of how I wanted the song to sound, and Eddie's vocal performance, amazing, and just this whole thing. But when the front started, I just thought that the guitar sound was horrible. I just thought it was one of those guitar sounds that's sort of trying to half break up but doesn't really work. And it sounded like a bad Rolling Stones guitar to me. And of course, this is just my opinion. I didn't say that to Stone. So I thought, I know what I'll do then. I'll just make it sound like it's coming out of a radio. So I chucked it in through an EQ and, took all the bass out and added all the middle and took all the top off and compressed it and thought, okay, that's pretty good. And then I realized there was a vocal because Eddie starts singing over the front. So I thought, oh, okay, well, I'll make that telephone as well. So it's coming out the same radio. So we did that. And I thought, okay, right, let's see how it works in the song. And then when the bass comes in, the bass has got this fretless, which is big slide comes in and it's so full frequency. And the intro being lo-fi and no bass, when the fretless comes in, it's such a surprise to the ear that it makes it sound amazing. And it was an accident. It wasn't like I thought at the beginning, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll make the bass sound big because I'll make the sound small. I just basically was trying to fix a shitty sounding guitar. And when I got it together and I listened, I was like, wow, that's cool. That's how it became like that. But those sort of happy accidents are things to really move towards rather than away from.
For sure. So then that kind of brings me up to another question, which is, we talked earlier about that idea of like perfecting things and fixing things and how you're not afraid to re-record parts if you need to. As far as like embracing some of those imperfections, do you have a process of like seeing what you can get away with first with the original, maybe the flaws of the record or the imperfections of it, and then moving on? Or like, what's your approach to dealing with those imperfections and understanding when and when not to keep those?
Yeah, I mean, imperfections, it's interesting because there's a lot of different imperfections, aren't there? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, sometimes it might be a sound you don't like. Sometimes it might be the performance. Sometimes it might be the tuning. And it's on an individual basis. I mean, as I said, sometimes something being a little bit strange tuning-wise on a vocal is part of the defining quality of that song. It might make it sound melancholy. It might make it sound exciting. So you don't just fix things for fix's sake. Same with the guitar. Maybe at a certain point in a song, that crappy small sounding guitar actually is exactly what the song needs. It needs a crappy small sounding guitar. So you don't fix things based on things like sonic quality or imperfections. You fix things because the song as a whole, I might be listening to a song and think, okay, well, the second verse is good, but there's that guitar there. I really feel like I want more from the song at this point, and there's nothing there. So I'm going to double that guitar and put an octave on it just for the second verse and then tuck it in and it'll give me a little lift. Something like that. So it's not so much fixing all the imperfections. Of course, you'll fix something that you feel is bad. There's no doubt about it. Sometimes if somebody hits a certain point in the song and he does the first one and it just feels so good and the second one just doesn't quite cut it, you might think, okay, well, I'll fix that one, or I'll even, if I'm naughty, I might even grab it from that one. But essentially, you just got to, it's an individual basis all the time. It's not a problem with small sounds and bad sounds. I've always thought that however you get to a sound, as long as it works for the song, it doesn't matter if it's badly recorded. Maybe it needs to be badly recorded to work. So it doesn't matter at all. It has to sit in an emotional space, every part that you have. If it's working in that emotional space, there's probably 2 or 3 ways it could be presented. But if it's in that space, you're okay. If it needs to be like a small, haunting, distorted guitar, you could try 1, you could try 2, you could try 3, and they might all work. But as long as it's in that emotional space, then you're good. So, it's, as I said, it's every part is different, and you have to just think about it individually.
That makes a lot of sense. It's one of those things that makes a record sound unique, right? Like those imperfections are a good thing. And going back to what we talked about earlier, how you said you might just clean up certain sections of a song, but maybe, that same thing happens again in another part of the song, but it's a little sloppier the second time. Like they make each part of the song have its own uniqueness to it. Those little earworms that maybe subconsciously we pick up on. So I think that's what makes the record sound cool and gives them a lot of character.
I mean, an interesting thing I found now, and I think it all boils down to just the amount of time that people put into crafting their music. If you had a recording budget and, you were able to give up your job and make records for a living, we used to spend a long time making a record. So if you were working on a rhythm guitar part against a vocal, you'd make sure it was spot on to how you thought it should be. Nowadays, if you've got one day in a studio and you've got all your mates and you've all chipped in to pay for the studio, you might just use that take and that's it. But I find when I receive something in a mix sometimes, I think, okay, so the first verse was pretty cool. Nothing's changed mix-wise or band-wise, but the second verse just doesn't really work. The drums seem fine. And then it's obvious. It's because the guitar player is rushing. So because he's rushing, he's ahead of the drums, of course, and your ear is being drawn to the guitar part. So instead of like listening to the drums and bass and vocal together like this, in the second verse, you feel like the guitars are too loud, but they're not too loud. You just need to nudge them back because he's so ahead. You nudge them back and then you put a little crossfade in and you go, oh, there we go. I didn't even need to touch the level. Once they were sitting in the groove, in the pocket, then they sounded fine. So with the technology we have nowadays, I'm very conscious when I'm working of things that, okay, that's rushing, but that's pretty cool, actually. I like it. It's rushing. Don't touch it. But other times you go, why is that sound so, why is it sticking out? And why does it not feel right? Oh, it's because it's out of time. Fix it. Now it sits in the track. Thank you very much. So you can actually change the balance of the music by the timing, right? Obviously.
Yeah, I was recently talking with Michael Beinhorn, and he was talking a lot about that and how like his approach is that like things don't need to be, and that maybe they shouldn't necessarily be right on the grid. That there's like an acceptable amount of sway from that click, and if everyone's consistent, if the guitar is always consistently like 5 milliseconds ahead or whatever, that's not a bad thing. That can be really cool, and that can give you that groove. But again, if it's distracting, then obviously you have to go in and fix it.
But the same thing, if you use just switch it around, use the same logic as what we just said. If you're listening to the song and you just think, I just want it to sound a bit more uncomfortable and edgy, and you could nudge the guitar forward and you suddenly go, oh, wow, now I'm getting into what that guy's playing with. He's got a great feel, and you're concentrating on that. So, it's not always fixing. Sometimes it's bringing it forward to give it a vibe. So it's just that we have that power now to be aware of those things, which we didn't have before. There's no way when I was mixing songs in the 80s that I would have even dreamt of any of that stuff. You just mixed it and did the best you could with what you had, and it was a whole different way of working completely. Still great fun, but very different.
For sure. Well, I mean, I guess that's one of the benefits of digital is that we now have all of this data in front of us, and it's very easy to manipulate that data and to understand how, when something is a little bit ahead or a little bit later, how that impacts the mix. And it's a lot easier than trying to do it on tape, that's for sure. So it can really start to impact the way we work, and it can change the grooves of our songs. And yeah, I just think that all of that, everything we've talked about in today's episode is just like finding these little details of what makes a mix special. And somehow a lot of this stuff is the stuff that listeners don't even know about, and the band sometimes doesn't even know about. But to someone, for a mixer who is good at their craft, all of these little details are important. I just think it's been really cool to have you talk about this, because it's a lot of stuff that people are afraid to mention.
There's so many things now, like just even the concept of octaves on parts and things. Like if you're working on a chorus, sometimes if I'm looking for something extra in a chorus, I might just use that little altar boy plugin and take the vocal up a full octave and distort the crap out of it, and then just mix a tiny bit behind the lead. And you could take it in and out and you can hear the difference. Oh yeah, that's making a big difference. But you couldn't discern what it is. So when you play it to a band, they're not going to say, oh, I like that high vocal, because they don't actually hear it. They just think their vocal sounds a bit more uplifting in the chorus. Things like that. Or there's a feature in Pro Tools where you can pull the audio track down and it converts it to MIDI. And you pull it down onto a track, find a keyboard sound, something airy, and you can, as I mentioned it earlier, and you can mix that behind the vocal in a certain section, so it gives it a certain quality, whether it's glassy or percussive or whatever it is, things like that. Mixing high string parts in the back of choruses, just a single note that goes through that creates a tension. You don't notice the part, but you feel the tension. You're like, whoa, it sounds a bit more, whoa. And, things like that can be going on. And as a mixer, when I present my work to an artist at the beginning, I don't say anything about what I did. Because I don't want everyone to pat me on the back for what you did. I just want them to say they like it. And if they like it, I'm happy. And then later I might say, oh, just so you know, I added quite a few new bits onto that. And you can say it later if you want to. But yeah, you don't tell them beforehand. That would be a foolish mistake, because you'll get some bad reactions to that stuff. Just make it sound the best that you can, and assuming that you have good taste and you understand what you're trying to achieve, and they buy into the way that you make records, and you should be fine.
Of course, yeah. It reminds me of like early on, I did make the mistake of telling people what I was doing. And I remember like working with a couple artists where I would put distortion on their voices, and they'd hear like the distorted vocal and be like, whoa, what are you doing there? And it's like, just trust me, this is going to work. And I'd tuck it underneath, and they'd be like, oh shit, that does sound pretty good. But when they hear just like the raw distorted vocal, they're like, what is this? What are you doing to my track? So it's like building trust with people, but also sometimes, yeah, they don't need to know what the magic is, and just do it. And, makes their voice sound better, go for it,
Yeah, the distortion plugins and the opportunity to really get in there and clip things now is amazing. It's just amazing. I mean, you got to remember that we would walk into a mix room in the 80s, and you walk into a new studio and you go, oh, great. Okay, so here's the equipment, right? What do we got? Okay, well, we've got 2 compressors, we've got a couple of reverb plates, we've got an AMS harmonizer and a couple of other delays, and that's it. So you'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to use the first compressor on the bass, I'm going to use the second compressor on the vocal, and we haven't got any others, so that's fine. And that was it. But now, I mean, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, you could literally have 20 plugins on every single thing if you so desired. And it's just, we have no compromise now. You've got no compromise. You can do it.
Fair. Well, there is a magic to that simplicity as well, right? And I think sometimes having the ability to do a lot can also be a crutch too, and could be disastrous if you go too far with it.
Well, I think, as I said, I think a lot of it worked because people recorded things properly.
Fair.
People spent the time. So you'd have a compressor when you're recording a bass, or you'd have stuff, and as everything went down, you were getting it much closer to how you thought the finished product would be. Plus, the beauty of tape. I mean, there's many things that weren't good about tape, but one of the things that was good about tape is obviously the saturation. So everything had a certain vibe, and it was sort of held in place a little bit, and that was a nice thing. I mean, I've got some sessions that are just transfers of multitracks that I did, and it's shocking when you look at the waveforms, because they really have been sunk into the tape nicely, and they sound killer because of that. And now we have to use tape simulators, and because things can get too pointy and too bright and too nasty, so squashing things with distortion, and you can do it. It just takes a bit of time.
Yeah, of course. Well, man, Tim, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's a really good one for people to hear, because often it's I find a lot of engineers just want to talk about the surface level things, the obvious things that they do, like EQ or compression, whatever. But it's all these little details that are really what separates someone from an amateur and makes them professional. And it is very refreshing to hear that. And a lot of the little details that you're putting into your cymbals, samples, and, overdubs and all that kind of stuff, it's just not compromising and making sure that you're getting the best sound out of the tracks that you work on. And I think that's really important. And that's why obviously you've had such a great career and why you continue to as well. So I just want to say thank you so much for doing this and for sharing all that information with people. If people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I've got a website, timpalmer.com, and I also encourage anyone who wants to follow me on Instagram, Tim Palmer Mixer. You can find me there. And yeah, I mean, there's lots on my website, lots of the interviews I've done and stuff like that. But yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely include those in the show notes as well. Tim, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate this.
Oh, I enjoyed it. You're very welcome.
Thank you. So that was my chat with Tim Palmer, and I thought it was really cool and refreshing to hear the attention to detail that he puts into his mixes and all of those little things that he's paying attention to. Everything from checking the phase of his samples to how he goes about adding extra sample layers to give himself more control, or how he'll re-record things. He just puts so much attention to everything to make sure that when he starts his mixes, he's starting from a foundation that's going to allow him to get that sound he hears in his head to come out of his speakers. And it's a lot of stuff that I think people are just generally afraid to try doing to a mix because they don't want to mess with the artist's performance, or they think that they're going to hurt some egos if they do something, or that it's not their place to do certain things. But at the end of the day, when an artist is coming to you to give them the best sounding mix that you can make, if that means that you have to go the extra mile to do extra little tweaks to get the sound that you want to come out, so that you can present your best version of the mix to the artist, then you need to be willing to go that extra mile and to take care of some of those little details. And it might not always be the thing that you're getting paid to do, but what you are getting paid to do is give them the best sounding mix. And whatever steps are necessary, you need to do that. So I think it's really important to hear about these little details and to hear the extent of what professionals are doing with their tracks, so that when you're working on your own songs or you're working on songs that people submit to you to mix for them, don't be afraid to go the extra mile, because it's what's going to make you sound better than everyone else. It's going to set your productions apart. And obviously for Tim, it has led to him having an amazing long career where he's worked with some major artists. And I mean, he didn't name names of projects that he's re-recorded stuff for, but he did say that there have been some pretty big records that he's had to do stuff like that on. And so I think there's a lot of people that would just be like, I can't do that. That's not my place, or I don't want to step on toes. But like Tim said, maybe the artist doesn't need to know about it, and maybe they shouldn't know about it. But as long as at the end of the day, they get what they paid for, which is an amazing sounding track, then you have to be willing to go that extra mile. And so, yeah, I want to encourage you to pay attention to a lot of those little details when you get a track. Ask yourself, can something be improved? Is there something that you can do to take it across the finish line and to enhance upon the tracks that you were provided with to mix, because it can really go a long way and make you end up with a better sounding track as a result of it. And who knows where those tracks will lead your career. So yeah, I really enjoyed this episode because it sheds a light on all of those little things that matter and that most of the time the fans don't know about, the artists don't know about, but it makes it sound better. So yeah, very, very cool to hear from Tim and to have him share that kind of stuff with us. So yeah, I hope that you enjoyed that episode and that you found that as insightful as well. And if you did enjoy this episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you're not already. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're listening to this episode and you're thinking, well, that's cool that Tim talked about these things, but I don't know what kind of things to pay attention to. Tim does, I don't. And if you're struggling to get your tracks to feel professional or to sound professional, but you're not quite sure what's needed to get them to cross that finish line, and you want some help along the way, that is something I would love to help you out with. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's what I work with my students on. We focus on establishing what your goal is for your songs. What do you want it to sound like? And then we listen to where you're at, and we reverse engineer the process, and we go through the entire production process from recording, editing, and mixing to make sure that you end up with the exact steps needed to get your tracks to sound exactly as you hear them in your head. And you end up with a repeatable system that you can implement to all of your songs so that moving forward, you can mix with speed and confidence and the peace of mind of knowing that you're going to be able to get your tracks to sound pro every single time. So if you want one-on-one help with your tracks and you're interested in learning more about how to get that, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude and you can find all the details there. And on that site, there is a button to click to get a free demo of Amplitude. That demo is basically a call with me where we're going to go through your production process. We're going to talk about your goals, what's working for you, what's not working for you. And then if it seems like I can truly help you, then I'll walk you through the program. I'll show you what it's all about and give you a tour of it. That way, you know exactly how this program can help you. And I would love to work with you inside to help you cross that finish line with your tracks so that you can finally feel proud of them and be at a point where you want to share them with the world. So once again, make sure to check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude to get all the details there. And then with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.